Welcome to Chapter 15. This chapter we're going to explore interpersonal and organizational communication. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to answer these questions. What do you need to know about the communication process to be an effective communicator? How can you use different channels and patterns of communication to your advantage? What are the important barriers that you need to be aware of so you can improve your communication skills? How do contemporary managers use social media to communicate more effectively? And how you can be a better listener, reader, writer, and speaker. So when we think about the communication process, what is it exactly and how does it work? Communication is the transfer of information and understanding from one person to another. It's like a funnel. And you are considered an efficient communicator when you can transmit your message accurately in the least amount of time. To be an effective communicator is when the message that you intend to convey is accurately understood by the other person. So if you say that the red house has a blue door, if the person who you're conveying this message translates your message to say the red house has a blue door, then you were effective at doing so. You're efficient if the message was transmitted in the least amount of time so that it was accurate, but it does not necessarily mean that it's effective. And so you have to consider how good of a communicator that you really think you are. There was a survey that was conducted of 400 employers in the United States and of 613 college students. And through this survey, it was revealed that more than 80% of employers and 75% of students believe that oral and written communication skills are important for workplace success. But oddly enough, while more than 60% of students reported they were skilled in oral and written communication, only 27% of employers endorsed this conclusion. So the students believed that they were skilled, but employers were saying, no, you're really not that skilled. So you may be efficient in sending a group of people a reprimand. You can go off on a tyrant or chastising people or whatever by email. But it may not be effective if that makes them feel angry, so they can't absorb its meaning. So if they shut down at any part in your message, then your message is not effective because they then don't accurately understand what you're trying to say. Do you see the difference? So when we look at the communication process, you see the two individuals. The gentleman on the left is the sender. The woman on the right is the receiver. And what we're doing is, as the sender, you're going to encode a message using a certain medium. It could be telephone, it could be email, text message, whatever. And the message is going to say, did you finish your assignment? That's the message. It's transmitted through that medium. What happens is when it's being transmitted, there's noise. It could be static, it could be slurring, it could be background noise, it could be music, it could be anything that is causing the information to be distorted or not fully heard. And so when the question is, did you finish your assignment? The receiver, who's now going to decode the message and then have to decide if whether or not feedback is needed, she then says, well, what assignment do you mean? So that message now comes back. The receiver expresses a reaction or feedback through the medium that was used, whether it was telephone or whatever. And at that point, the conversation continues because now he's going to have to decode her message to then give her the feedback of elaborating as to what specific assignment until eventually his initial question has been answered. So encoding is how we translate that message into any kind of understandable language or symbol. Decoding is how we interpret and try to make sense of the message. And so you can see how in the communication process, when you have various barriers, including language differences, the use of slang and different colloquialisms, and when we're using memes and gifs and all kinds of things, it can really create a distorted view and make the encoding and decoding of messaging very difficult in the communication process. So let's look at how noise can disrupt this process. As I mentioned earlier, we can have background noise, we can have language barriers, and then we consider semantics because we have jargon, buzzwords, we have nonverbal cues. And so with this process, it can be disrupted in so many different ways. And any kind of disturbance that interferes with the transmission of a message is what we call noise. This can happen both in the encoding or decoding of a message. As well, like I said, when we have a language barrier and you have different cultures and you're stumbling over the languages because something may not translate fully to the other person. This can happen within the same culture when we encounter semantic problems. And those are anything that revolve around the meaning of a word. How, we joke around, okay, potato, potato, tomato, tomato, right? Where the word has more than one meaning. So, for instance, when your manager tells you we need to get this done right away, what does it mean? And does we mean just you? Does it mean you and your coworkers? Does it mean you, your coworkers, and your manager? Who is involved in this? And what does right away mean? Does this mean within the hour? Does this mean sometime today, tomorrow, next week? When is right away? So you have these words that then need to be broken down, and you need to have the specifics. Sometimes some of us don't stop to say, okay, so who's all involved in this? What is it? What are you referring to? Who's involved? And what's the deadline? At that point, then now I know what you mean when you say we need to get this done right away. Some of us don't take the time to get the clarification, and that's where we have some major disruption in our communication process. Now, when we look at jargon, that's terminology that's specific to a particular profession or group. So, person in human resources, the VP, wants the RFP to go out ASAP. The HR VP wants the RFP to go out ASAP. That is translated into the Vice President of Human Resources wants the request for proposal to go out as soon as possible. Well, if you're not part of that profession, that group, that understanding, those are a bunch of letters that don't mean much. The only thing that you possibly know is that wants and to go out. You may know ASAP, but maybe you don't. So buzzwords are designed to impress rather than inform. So we have our jargon, now buzzwords, and they can really cause a lot of disruption in the communication process, because like you could say, could our teams interface on the ad campaign that went viral and then circle back with the boss? Oh, what? Okay. Where am I being informed in that statement? Could our teams interface on the ad campaign that went viral and then circle back with the boss? Those are buzzwords. Those are buzzwords. Interface, viral, circle back. Those are buzzwords. Let's break it down. Something really simple. Can our teams get together and discuss the ad campaign that was a success? And then can we then come back after we've spoken about it, dissected on how it went, where we could have improved, and then go back to our boss about our findings and to get further feedback and things like that. That at that point is going to inform you. The first example is just to impress. It just sounds catchy. It sounds snazzy. We're going to interface, viral, circle back. Those are buzzwords, which don't help if someone is not really enlightened into what those words mean. It ends up being noise. So we can also have noise that occurs during our nonverbal communication, and that's when we use physical movements and our words send totally different messages. And you can think of different ways in which we do that. You know, our arms are crossed. It looks like our lips are pouted. We're rolling our eyes. How we shift in our seat, the slumped shoulders. Those can all send a lot of nonverbal cues. The raising of an eyebrow, the sucking of your teeth. You know, so many different ways that can send a message that is totally different than what we verbalize. So I want you guys to think of different examples of how noise can reduce the effectiveness of communication. Then I want you to consider the right medium that you would use based on the message that you're trying to convey. There are tons of communication tools that are available to you that range from one-on-one, face-to-face conversations, all the way to using mass media platforms. But you need to know as a manager how to use the right tool for the right condition and when to use, for instance, email versus face-to-face. And should you congratulate a team for exceeding its goals by addressing the group in person, sending them an email, posting an announcement near the water cooler or the office machine, or you put in a break room, or do you do all three? Like, you have to then decide what's the right medium to use. And all media have their own advantages and disadvantages. And so you have to look at the different criteria to consider when to choose the right medium at the right time. And so, for instance, texts and tweets require that you are very brief, right? You only have so many characters you can use. You have to be brief and precise. And then with emails, you provide a record of the communication that the in-person and phone communication don't, because now you have a written transcript that has a date and time stamp on it. And so those are various ways in which you can use that. They can also be sent almost without regard to time zone differences. Unlike if you had to do a voice call, or you had to do a video call or in-person message, what happens is you have some time constraints as when you can do that. But with a written communication, something that you also have to be considerate of is the fact that they often fail to convey any kind of nuances of meaning through your tone of voice, your body language. And what that means is that what I may type in a email or a text, it may come across totally different than what I intend the message to convey. In addition to the fact that I can't then fully receive what you're encoding and decoding through that message. And so all of that has to be considered. And then when you're thinking about how a message can be misinterpreted, written is a great way for a message to be misinterpreted. Because if I'm sitting in front of you, or we're doing a video call, and I can hear the tone of your voice and I can see your body language, it allows me to pause the conversation to gain clarification or to make sure that we're on the same page, which we cannot necessarily do in written form, because I can't see if you're rolling your eyes to my email. No different than you listening to me right now on this video. I have no clue how you're receiving what I'm saying. It would be different if I'm able to see you, and and you could see me, or at least if I could hear you while I'm talking through this video. Then at that point, I would be able to gain clarification as to whether or not you understand fully what I'm saying, and to what point. Now, there have been, of course, many managers that you find out that a simple phone call can cut through layers of misinterpreted emails. It's proven. Sometimes things are taken way out of context in an email, and only through a phone call or a face-to-face, meeting, there you're able to break things down, cut through the nonsense and the clutter, and get to the core of the message and what was intended. So we can generally categorize differences between communication media in terms of whether a given medium is what is considered rich or lean. High versus low media richness is what that means. It's the depth and breadth of what you're receiving in the message. And so when you look at low media richness, these are best for routine, clear situations. So you're using flyers and newsletters, general reports, they're impersonal. When you're looking for a rich, very voluptuous, meaty content, right, which is non-routine, there's ambiguous situations, face-to-face presence is the highest of media richness that you can get. Why? Because we're here, there's a lot of clarification. We can now dig through the layers, and any questions that can be asked can also be answered at that time. And so you can see the scale in which you can select the right medium based on what the message consists of, and and where you believe that there will be a higher likelihood of a question, and a response to those questions would be necessary, where there'd be feedback that would be required. So when we look at our formal communication channels, you're following a chain of command that are recognized as official through your organization. And when you look at the org chart that is described in Chapter 8, you remember that there is some official communications. We have our memos, our letters, reports, announcements, and those are supposed to be routed out, right? Formal communication, we have 3 different types. We have vertical, which means it's upward and downward. We have horizontal, which means it's lateral, right? It's sideways. And external, which means anything that's outside of the organization. And so when you look at those several types, vertical is going to go up and down the chain of command. That's how most of us kind of think about how communication flows in an organization. Downward is strictly coming from the top to the bottom. So that's coming from your C-suite leaders, your senior leaders in an organization, and that communication is being forced downward. Upward communication is things that are going on the front line, and that communication is being fed up to the top. Horizontal is when we're flowing any information between certain units and divisions within the organization. And external is any information that we're getting that's coming from the outside in. So think of different examples of how, as a manager, you can communicate using these types: vertical, horizontal, external, right? But also when you look at the downward and upward as well. Now, here's a question for you. Jeremy shares information with his fellow task force members about their project. Jeremy is communicating which of these 4? Externally, downward, upward, or horizontally? Informal communication channels. These help you to develop outside the formal structure, and they don't follow the chain of command. They're more spontaneous. You can skip management levels, and you can cut across lines of authority. As a public speaker and communications coach, Carol Kinsey Gorman says that social media has put the grapevine on steroids. You can't outrun the rumor mill, and you can't kill it. The challenge is to understand how the grapevine works within your organization and how you can most effectively influence. So we have our 2 types of communication channels. That's the unofficial communication system of the informal organization, your grapevine. That's the rumor mill right there. That's where you then say what you heard of how Bill was fired, how Pam got a promotion, and it can just spread like a grapevine. Then you have your face-to-face, where this is some authentic human time with the boss. And despite the entrenched use of quick and efficient electronic communication on our lives, face-to-face conversation is still justifiably a major part of most of our work. We value that human contact with our manager, and we welcome the implication that through this face-to-face, it expresses and means to us that this person actually cares about us and our opinions, and they value us within the organization. It helps to build relationships and trust, and it shows respect for us as individuals, and it's really motivating. It keeps us motivated more so than us receiving emails and texts and IMs and things of that nature. That face-to-face can be very helpful. And not just when we're being punished, right? But when we're being rewarded, when we're being supported, when someone's coming through and seeing how well we're doing and how they can be of assistance to helping us reach the goals. So how do we make the most of our face-to-face communication? And this is really a focus on for managers and how we prioritize these 5 steps rather than hoping to catch people at random times through the day. It can be very difficult. So we're scheduling time with individual employees and making sure that we'll both be free of distractions, right? So no cell phones, nothing, no alerts popping up. And just for those few minutes, right? It's a quick kind of thing. It's not the moment to multitask. It's where you're really being intentional. So it's making the time for that. It's listening not just to the words the other person is saying, but also the emotional content behind those words. It's listening more and talking less, and making sure that we make eye contact. We're observing body language. You're gaining clarification, understanding, and this will help you to be more empathetic, right? Because you're actually trying to walk in the shoes of this person as they're explaining and expressing what they're experiencing. And a topic that is discussed in the last section of this chapter helps you to really learn more about being empathetic. So then when it's your turn to speak, make sure you're brief, right? Because when it's really lengthy and wordy, there comes the noise. It's too much that comes in. We become distracted. And what happens is when you talk for long periods of time, that person then, of course, can't interrupt. If they do, sometimes they're chastised or whatever. It throws you off of your train of thought. But also, by the time they're given an opportunity to speak, they forgot what they wanted to speak about. So taking notes would be multitasking, which means they're not fully listening. But the only way for them to be able to remember what they want to say is by taking notes. So you have to make sure that when you speak, it's brief. I know I'm guilty of this. I can be very long-winded when I'm having conversations with people. And so I have to remind myself to do short bursts. Keep it brief. So if your message is specific or factual, make sure that you prepare your facts and outline your thoughts ahead of time, and make sure that you expect questions and that you're prepared with answers. So that's one way. The third is making sure when we're delivering good news, we do so up front. You lead into bad. You layer it like a sandwich. So happy tidings don't require a long build-up, right? Bad news and controversial decisions, however, go so much better when you build up to them. So you layer it like a sandwich. You start with something good, you bring in something that's not so good, you bring in something good, you bring in something not so good, you bring in something good, you layer it like a sandwich. And then that way you can help explain the situation, identify factors you can't control, give the person on the other side of this argument its due, right? Give the other side its due. Allow them the ability to help to break down any misunderstandings or whatever, or to clear up anything that was seemed as factual that was actually not. But always, when there's bad news, bring it as a sandwich. And you guys notice that when I grade your coursework, I will I always start off with something good. I'll then point out what you did wrong. I always end with something good. I give you a sandwich. Now, for our in-person meetings for groups of employees, hold employee town hall meetings. This is a really great way of doing it. You can hold it monthly or quarterly, and it usually consists of a presentation by managers with an open Q&A session. This is question and answer, and be available for informal conversations with individuals afterwards. So you have to make sure that, because there's some people that are just naturally nervous about asking questions in front of groups. So always make sure that you set aside time for those informal conversations with someone who may need some specific clarification about something that they may not have wanted known to the entire group. Town hall meetings are a great way for politicians to communicate with their constituents. It's the same within your organization. It's a great way for your employees to be able to meet with senior leaders of your team when there are certain factors that directly impact them, especially major things. The fifth thing is, when you can't be there, use webcast, and you can achieve this FaceTime even with employees that work remotely. the webcast, video conferencing, having social video portals, and that keeps communications direct and personal. And if possible, try to make sure everyone has the same experience. So try avoiding having meetings that mix in-person and remote attendees, because it doesn't give that same kind of experience. You need to really try to focus that everyone is kind of in that same sphere and realm, if that makes sense. Now, how can we streamline our meetings? When you're leading the meeting, you should make sure that you're setting a clear goal and communicate it beforehand. You start and end on time. Use frequent short meetings, not infrequent long ones, and you follow up within 24 hours. Oftentimes, you spend a great deal of your time in meetings and too much time when you really think about it, right? I don't like meetings, and when I'm in them, I want them to be short and to the point. Don't put me in a 4-hour meeting. Unless this is a war room kind of situation and it's a working meeting where we're getting things done, if we're just here to hear someone speak, it just drives me batty. And so what they've realized is that most mid-level managers average more than 20 meetings a week. That's a lot. And workers reportedly judge that nearly 50% of their meetings are really just a waste of time. They can actually be consolidated into a memo, right? Or an email. So, as I said earlier, a productive meeting is short. It's held in convenient locations, away from distraction. It's attended only by the people who will most directly be affected by the decisions made and who can contribute mostly to solving the problems. It's not supposed to be where it's just we're sharing this big problem and then you have a bunch of people who are scared. They're not problem solvers. So those are the two things. If you're going to directly be affected, or you can contribute to solving problems. Now, make sure that you share your agenda at least a day ahead of time. Be the first person to arrive. You're the leader of the meeting. You need to be the first one there. Stick to your time limits on each agenda item and gently but firmly cut off any kind of unproductive discussion. And so, like, for instance, you'd say, like, okay, thanks for your contribution, James. Let's quickly hear from one more person before we moved on to the next point. So you're gently cutting it off. You're not being rude about it. Then the third thing, as the leader of the meeting, make sure that people are focused better during meetings of an hour or less. As I mentioned, it has to be short and to the point. When you start getting over that hour point, that better be a working meeting. That better be that we're sitting down and actually going through steps of resolving a problem or finding solutions. Like at the end of that meeting, we're going to have some deliverables, some kind of work product at the end of the meeting. Anything other than that needs to be an hour or less. And then you have within 24 hours to send a summary and follow up or recap the to-do list. And so that could be some minutes to the meeting. It could be a to-do list so everybody's reminded as what they were assigned to do or what they agreed to do. And that list needs to be followed up with within 24 hours so everybody stays on top. Now, when you're a participant, you need to make sure you're prepared, on time, you participate intelligently, and we're going to go into that a little further, and you follow up with your to-do list. So you need to make sure you read that agenda in advance, prepare any kind of facts or data that you're supposed to provide, and make sure that when you come in, you turn that cell phone off. You put it on silent, I don't know what, but you don't need any distractions. When you show up late, it's disrespectful and disruptive, right? It's disrespectful to the meeting leader. It's disrespectful to the other participants. It's disruptive because you throw everyone off because now our attention is on you. It can also cause the meeting to run over because if the leader decides to wait for you, now something that was supposed to be an hour long or 30 minutes long can now be 2+ hours long because of you. Third, make sure that you expect to contribute to the meeting somehow. And make sure that your contributions are brief, professional, and on point. Don't go off on some long tangent. Don't talk about anything that's dealing with whatever that is not relevant. And make sure that it's professional, that there's no offhanded jokes or commentary. And then 4, if you had a to-do list, if somehow you agreed to do something or you were assigned to do something, make sure that you act on it in a timely manner. Make sure that you follow up and that you meet your deadlines by or before that agreed upon time. Now, let's look at some different barriers. Table 15.2 shows some barriers that happen when we communicate. And All it takes is one blocked step in this process for communication to fail. All it takes is one of these to have some kind of mishap, and it just communication breaks down. So when we have sender barrier, that's when no message gets sent, right? It's just silent. Somebody is doing the silent treatment, for instance. Encoding barrier is when the message is not expressed correctly. So there's no way for me to now decode. It's what is not coming through. And then with medium barrier, that's when the communication channel itself is blocked. So that could be the phone line are down, or it's breaking up. So, but there's a barrier. Something is blocking it. So I can't decode. You can't fully encode. Decoding barriers, when I don't even understand the message. I have no clue what you're talking about. So how can I then be able to respond? So then I'm going to respond back and say, what are you talking about? Or I don't get it. Or, huh? Receiver barrier is when no message is received. I didn't get it. And so when you're like, why didn't you respond to my email? What email? I didn't get your email. And most likely I didn't get your email because, there's a medium barrier. You know, the server was down, or the internet was out, or whatever. Then feedback barrier is when me as the recipient, I don't respond enough. I'm very vague in my response. And so what happens, you don't get enough feedback to know whether or not I fully understand, if I agree, disagree. I'm kind of only rationing out my response to you. So one blocked step in the process can literally create a failure in communication. So here's another question for you. Greg was thinking about how he just did on his e-contest when his management professor talked about tomorrow's quiz. This is an example of which barrier? Encoding, decoding, medium, or receiver? Greg is thinking about how he just did on his econ test. His management professor is now talking about tomorrow's quiz in the management class. What barrier is Greg now faced with? Not only Greg, but his professor, because we're having an issue with the communication. Which barrier? Encoding, decoding, medium, or receiver? Now, let's look at our personal barriers. There's attributes that hinder communication. We have variable skills in how we can go about communicating effectively, and there's different ways in which we process and interpret information. And there's also different ways in which we build trustworthiness and credibility within ourselves and each other. There are certain things that come into play, such as if you have an oversized ego, your pride, your self-esteem, if you're arrogant, this really will hinder our communication. If you're not a great listener, if you have some faulty listening skills, if your mindlessness, if your mind floats, if you get easily distracted, if all of a sudden you're doing a grocery list when you're supposed to be paying attention to me, or you're busy looking for your counter argument to my argument, it can be a hindrance. Our tendency to judge others' messages. So whether you're judging it for accuracy, or you're judging it for interpretation, or you're judging it based on my accent, or you're judging based on the fact that I used the wrong word at the wrong time, or just the wrong word in general, you're judging. You're not then listening, you're just judging. And then we have another hindrance, which can be our generational differences. So you have our baby boomer that's talking to a Gen Xer, or the baby boomer who's talking to the millennial, or any of those generation gaps where you're now, things are not translating in a way fully that can actually create a block. So I want you to think of how these individual attributes can all act as barriers that can hinder communication. Now we also have some cross-cultural barriers, and culture, as I've shared earlier in the class, is when we comprise our ideas and values, our material objects, any practices and customs that allow us as a group of people to, and even with an entire society, right? Because you can have an American culture, you can have a Jamaican culture, you can have a Russian culture, but you can then also narrow it down to a specific group. It could be something based on your religion, it could be based on your neighborhood, whatever. It could be based on race, whatever. And this is how you then carry out your collective lives. And basically, it's what you can consider some order and harmony. And it naturally affects the way we communicate. That doesn't mean there aren't language barriers, because there's still language barriers within our cultures. And then, of course, cross-culturally, because now we're having cultures that are now coming together, communicating, and that can create some barriers. And then certain signs and symbols that are nonverbal that mean something to one group can mean something different to another. And one thing that's very important anytime you have employees working abroad, which are called expatriates, you need to make sure that there's some cross-cultural training so they understand these different nuances and variables. And so success in these type of assignments working abroad can hinge on your ability to adapt, as well as having a strong cultural awareness, understanding your culture versus the culture in which you're now living and working in. And there's a Brookfield Global Relocation Services, and the executive vice president, Scott T. Sullivan, had said that their research indicates that one of the top 5 causes of assignment failure, right, of people that are working abroad, one of the top 5 reasons why it just does not work for them is their inability to adapt, which can be substantially prevented if there have been some extensive cultural training involved, versus you just planting someone and plopping them into this new culture, into this new country, into this new town, this new region, and you just put them there and tell them to just figure it out, just adapt. If they're not properly trained on the different nuances, it can be very difficult. Now let's look at, let me make sure I didn't skip. Okay, good. So our nonverbal communication, it consists of messages sent outside of the written or spoken word. And we primarily express nonverbal communication through 4 ways. We have our eye contact, facial expressions, body movements and gestures, and our touch, our human touch, whether that's handshake, hugs, touching an arm, touching someone's face, whatever. Now, there's some research that suggests about 55% of what we communicate is actually transmitted non-verbally. So more of our communication is through our eye contact, facial expressions, body movement and gestures, and touch, more so than it is what we write or speak verbally. So let's share some examples. Westerners use eye contact to signal the beginning and end of a conversation, right? We use it a lot. We use it to reflect interest and attention, to convey both honesty and respect. Then you look at our Asian brothers and sisters that will lower their eyes to show respect, right? So it's a different. Then in our Latin cultures, our Latin brothers and sisters will lower their eyes to show remorse. So think of this. If we're using, in the way that we can misinterpret that. You can totally misinterpret this. And so your ability to interpret these nonverbal communications as evasive behavior will lead to misunderstanding. If you're thinking, wow, they're just so disrespectful, they lowered their eyes. Well, if they're from an Asian country, they're often doing so to show a sign of respect. See the difference? So you're probably used to thinking that smiling represents warmth and happiness or friendship. And you're then probably raised to believe that frowning represents anger and dissatisfaction. But there are some people from different cultures that are less openly demonstrative than people in the U.S. So when you use an example of Japanese, they feel that those in the US smile way too much and way too broad, right? That our smiles are just too big. But it's normal for those of us that are raised in the United States to have these big, bold smiles. But there you go, with the difference in how we communicate culturally. Something else, our open body positions. So when we lean slightly backward, it expresses openness and warmth and closeness and availability for communication. Closed body positions, such as having your arms folded or your legs crossed, can represent defensiveness to some cultures. Interesting enough, I may cross my arms, but I'm not being defensive. It's just comfortable to me. I oftentimes will cross my legs, and depending on how I do so, and I'm not being defensive, it's just a comfort. But I am mindful of the fact when I am in groups that have more face-to-face, where there's more eye contact involved. Now, if I do it inside of a large seminar format, forum kind of format, I don't mind. But I know if it's a smaller group that I'm going to be making eye contact with the people that are speaking, I try to be mindful of my arms and my legs and how I'm positioned and how I lean, so that it is showing more of an openness versus a closed off. Something else to consider is the norms for touching also vary significantly around the world. So, of course, different countries, kissing on the cheek or patting on the shoulder and embracing may be appropriate in the United States, but many people in Asia find these actions offensive. Kissing on the cheek, both sides of the cheek, is common in certain European countries. But we really don't do that in the United States. We limit our kissing on the cheek for people that we have a close relationship with. It's a loved one. But in different parts of Europe, it is just a sign of affection for a stranger. You just come up and you meet someone, and it's pleasure to meet you, and it's a kiss on either side of the cheek, right? So, but you have to be mindful of the cultural differences, and that this all is nonverbal communication. So, how can we improve our nonverbal communication skills? And you can practice these skills by watching TV with the sound off. And what you should do is try to interpret people's emotions and their interactions. When you turn the sound off, then guess what? It's now allowing you to then think, what are they really expressing nonverbally? And table 15.3 shows you the ways in which you can do what you can do and don't. So make sure you maintain eye contact. Don't look away from the speaker. Make sure you lean towards the speaker, right? Don't turn away from the speaker. Speak at a moderate rate. Don't speak too quickly or too slowly. I have a tendency sometimes to speak too quickly. Speak in a quiet, reassuring tone is something you should do. Don't speak in an unpleasant tone. A lot of times Americans are considered too loud, especially, and then when you go down and you break it down culturally, African Americans, Latino Americans have also been, we're kind of labeled as too loud. Italian Americans have been told that they can be too loud. Do smile and show animation. Don't yawn excessively. Do occasionally nod your head in agreement, because it lets that person know, okay, I'm tracking with you. I understand. I agree with you. Don't close your eyes. Closing your eyes would most likely signal that you're falling asleep. You're bored. Do be aware of your facial expressions. I have to be mindful of my facial expressions because I really don't have a poker face. So what I'm thinking will display on my face. Don't lick your lips, bite your nails, play with your hair. That can send all the wrong kind of messages. Licking your lips, somebody may have an LL Cool J flashback. Biting your nails is usually a sign of nervousness. People oftentimes think that you may have some kind of nervous disorder. Playing with your hair is a sign of boredom. It could be a sign of immaturity. It could be also a sign of a nervous tic that you may have as well. People get really thrown off by things like that. Now let's look at our gender and communication differences, how we differ as men and women. And we process language in different parts of the brain, interesting enough, gender-based. So perhaps it's not surprising that these gender differences in communication exist. There was a series of more than 100,000 interviews with men and women executives that revealed some of these differences. And so what they found from these interviews is that women view questioning as their best contribution and they use questions to help spark ideas and build consensus and show concern for others, while men think women ask way too many questions. Men tend to interpret them as barriers to progress or signs of overly controlling behavior. Many women often feel excluded during meetings and discussions, while about 90% of men feel that women have equal opportunities to contribute. Both of them have a point, though, because women prefer to be asked to participate, while men assume that someone who doesn't voluntarily speak up simply has nothing to say. So with that, women need to learn how to voluntarily speak up, and men need to learn how to ask, is there anyone that wants to say something? Is there anyone that wants to contribute? Ebony, Susan, Cynthia, do you have anything that you want to add? Bill, is there anything you want to add? Marcus, is there anything you want to add? Where you have to be more mindful of the fact that not everyone is going to freely speak up. It doesn't mean that they don't have anything to say. Sometimes it's the fact that they're waiting to be asked. And something else that has to be considered is the fact that stress heightens different hormones in men and in women. And so men tend to withdraw and isolate themselves when problem solving. But women seem to seek out others for support, and they can actually interpret men's withdrawing as a lack of caring. That can be a barrier. So when we look at the difference in our communication characteristics, when we look at taking credit, men often use the I statements, more likely to boast about their achievements. I did this, I did that. While women tend to use we statements. We did this, we did that. So it's more of a group achievement versus a I achievement. Women are less likely to take credit when men are more likely to. Even if they played a small part, men are more likely to take credit for it. Displaying confidence. Men are less likely to indicate that they're uncertain about an issue, right? They'll almost always assert that they know, while women are most likely to indicate a lack of certainty about an issue. Being polite, men are more likely to appear certain and definitive, while women are greater users of qualifiers and hedging, right? So you're still trying to have this politeness, while men will be more aggressive. Focusing on messaging, men are more likely to focus on themselves and say me or I. Once again, it's that focus on self, while women are most likely going to focus on the other person and mention, we and you. Talking patterns, men are more likely to interrupt women and talk over other people, while women are less apt to interrupt men and less likely to talk over others. When it comes to listening, men are more likely to take in words and content, less likely to use positive overlaps like, I see you, or yeah, to help demonstrate that they're listening. Women are more likely to hear words and the emotions behind those words and use the positive overlaps to demonstrate listening, such as I agree or that's right. When it comes to answering questions, men are going to be quick and to the point, where women tend to provide more information that's needed, right? We can sometimes, sometimes people consider it overkill. When we use emoticons, right, the little smileys, men often use them more often to express sarcasm and banter, while women will use the smiling and laughing ones more than men. And then when we look at our nonverbal patterns, men are usually less expressive. They smile less, they focus more on words and nonverbal cues, less likely to touch, while women are more expressive. We smile more skilled at deciphering nonverbal cues, and more likely to touch. And so having these balances between the two is very key, especially when you're working in environments and industries that have a blend of men and women. So when we look at social media and how we go about managing, there's various web-based and mobile technologies that help us to interact with members of a network, and we can use these technologies to reach and interact with our customers in a new way. And there was a study that was done that had 9,200 travelers across 31 countries. And it provided insight about the impact of social media in our lives. And 81% of those travelers reported they would rather travel with their mobile devices than with a loved one. Is that not disturbing? So we've really become attached to social media, and as we explore these technologies, we can document their general use and then examine the effects of social media, on our effectiveness as managers as well as our organizational effectiveness, and then review any kinds of downsides to this use of social media, the key impacts on texting, and how that impacts our behavior as managers, but also as the organization as a whole. And then what needs that we have as an organization to develop some strong social media policies. When we look at the top social networks, you have Snapchat, Vine, Tumblr, Instagram, Twitter, Google+, Facebook, Pinterest, and LinkedIn. You can look at the age distribution of those users ages 18 and over, and this was used from December 2014, and I'm sure these numbers you'll see a skew. But in the blue, those are ages 18 to 24. The peach color is 25 to 34. The green is ages 35 to 44. The purple are ages 45 to 54. The yellow goldish hue is ages 55 to 64, and then you have the orange, which is ages 65 and older. And so, of course, you see the least amount of users for Snapchat is the age 65 and older group. The most users are from ages 18 to 24. Interesting enough, the largest user group of Google Plus are ages 65 and older. You have to really wonder why they use that platform more than any of the other platforms. Then when you look at, everything else kind of lines up pretty much, as a normal scale, right? But those are those two big ones. So you really wonder, like, what is so significant about Google Plus that our 65 and older group are using it more than any other group? Interesting. So what does this data suggest about the use of social media? And so we see the various networks of all the age groups, and although there's some differences across the age cohorts, it appears that all age groups use these tools, and that which underscores the need for us as managers to use social media tools with employees of all ages. But it's very interesting to see the whole Google Plus with the older group. Now, when we recruit and use social media, what we've realized is about 82% of companies will use social media for this purpose. And one of the top recruiting tools is LinkedIn, followed by Facebook and Twitter. And more than 70% of recruiters agree that social media allows you to more easily find candidates with specific sets of skills, and that more than 60,000 jobs are tweeted on Monster every day. And then when Career Builder said that about 52% of companies check out potential hires' social media pages, including their sometimes unguarded profiles on Facebook and LinkedIn. I used to be a corporate recruiter, and I can tell you that we always use social media to screen our candidates. We always found a way to use your name, use your email address, or to consider what names you possibly would use to find your social media, to see who you are personally, because what you put on your resume is not necessarily who you are in private. And it can also lead to hiring discrimination, right? Because at that point, we can find out your religious affiliation, your age, your family composition. We can find out your sexual orientation. We can find out what you're in, what you like, what you're involved in. If all of a sudden we find out that you're into some kind of drug use or some kind of activities that maybe we're biased about, it can lead to hiring discrimination. And to me, the rules have really changed a lot. And it can really prevent someone, a great candidate, from being hired because of this bias and discrimination. So some tips for building your professional profile online is making sure that you regularly update your profile at LinkedIn and any other industry-specific networking sites. Follow the companies you hope that'll hire you. Participate in industry-related chat rooms and discussion groups, and edit your general online social presence. Now, when we look at our productivity and how social media plays a role, when used appropriately, it can make communication more productive, but we have to be mindful of the fact that we can get lost in the social media world and lose hours. For instance, for me, I made a pact with one of my friends that we would take the summer off from using social media because it really had been a hindrance for us, because we weren't able to get some of our professional goals met because we would be on social media late at night. When if you're up at that time, then that's when you can do your other work, the work I need to do for my business, books that I'm trying to write, and then I don't have time during the day. Well, if I'm up at 1 o'clock in the morning, that's when I should be doing that. I shouldn't be on Snapchat or Facebook or anything else. And so we agreed to take off the summer to do so. So that is one way. You have to make sure there's a balance. Something else is that reduced turnover, higher performance, increased job satisfaction, greater creativity and collaboration are common findings in research on the effects of social media. Once again, it has to be a healthy balance. And then employees who work remotely are particular beneficiaries of social media's communications capabilities. And so we have to remember as managers that employees don't have to be in touch all the time, no matter how easy it is. There's plenty of evidence that everyone should be able to unplug from the email and social media on a regular basis, if not during every evening, weekend, and vacation. But you should, that's really where you should separate that from the workplace, because if not, you have your employees constantly plugged in, and that's how you end up with technology overload, right? Where people just, the stress is called techno stress. So you need to find ways that your employees are not connected all the time, especially to your company's social media activities or emails, things of that nature. There's some benefits to using social media, and there's companies of all sizes and industries believe in these benefits. Procter and Gamble, which is normally called like P&G, they spend more than any other company in the U.S. on advertising, and they devote more than more than a third of their marketing budget in the U.S. to digital media. And when you look at the benefits, you can connect in real time over distance, right? There's no distance factor. And you can collaborate within your organization, but also outside of your organization. Social media, by definition, is a way to connect people virtually. So it's effective where you have virtual teamwork. You can expand your boundaries because there's no limits to where it can go. And when we look at how we can combine innovation with social media, there are some different ways, such as crowdsourcing, where we use the internet and social media to engage and encourage people outside of your organization for help with solving a problem. So whether or not you're trying to raise funds, organize competitions, or you're trying to recruit, if you're looking for innovative solutions to a problem, then this is one great way of doing so, and you can come up with potential ideas that can be generated. And of course, there's a mixed record of success with that, because it does require some heavy effort on your side to make sure that you're constantly engaging people. And it can be helpful with sales and brand recognition because it can help increase awareness of your products and services. You can generate inquiries from customers. You can now be able to reach customers on a global scale, promote local businesses, and be able to help foster conversations with your customers about your various brands. There is a question as whether or not it's logical to expect that an effective social media presence can actually generate customers and brand recognition. And, is not necessarily the case, and not necessarily for all companies. So I want you to think of various examples of products or services that you learned about through social media, and whether or not their messaging was effective. Now, when we look at reputation and social media, there are some very big dangers that are involved that you have to face as a manager, and those are negative comments about your organization. When you have a disgruntled customer or employees, or you have people who are just lurking and just intentionally trying, they're trolling. So there's some various ways that you can diffuse or limit the harm to your organization. And that's by creating and enforcing a social media policy for your employees. This is going to be, we're going to go into that further in a little bit, but at a minimum, your policy should limit what employees can say on your webpage, your company webpage, and ensure that all posted content meets the highest ethical standards. You can appoint experienced managers to monitor your social media presence and respond quickly and appropriately to negative comments that are posted. Like, for instance, Vitamin Water waited 24 hours before responding to customers who voiced anger on Facebook about its new flavor. A Mississippi woman received an insensitive email from her state representative about her problems getting medical supplies for her diabetic child. She posted the legislator's response on Facebook, and it went viral. So a great deal of damage, of course, can occur online in a short amount of time. And of course, it's all public. Now, a third thing that you can use, another tip, is to acknowledge there's a problem. Just be open about it. Gracefully accepting that someone has a genuine issue with your organization, your product or service, any post that you share, even if the problem is a misunderstanding on their part, being able to gracefully accept that their person has an issue with it can go a long way towards diffusing bad feelings. Own up. Acknowledge this person's feelings. Acknowledge this person is hurt or angry or confused or whatever. Acknowledge it. It helps to diffuse it. If a person says, I am upset, and then say, I'm sorry that you're upset. Right? Now, you've taken ownership for the fact that you know this person is upset. If you're in error, if your company is in error, if your company's in the wrong, the appropriate manager should say so and should apologize without delay. Now, the fourth tip is this: take the conversation offline if necessary. If the customer refuses to be satisfied, try to get that conversation to a private arena, such as a phone call or email. Not only will this keep it out of the public eye and prevent further damage to your brand, but also it provides a more one-on-one experience. It gives that person individualized attention, and it can help to reduce their irritation even more. Now, there's some downsides of social media, which is called cyberloafing. And this is something that you have to always consider as a manager, that a lot of your employees can and do bring their own devices to work, and so they're perfectly capable of bypassing controls installed on your office computers. And some say that some of observers believe that reports of cyberloafing is to an extent exaggerating, that taking an online break from work might not be such a bad idea, that it can reduce stress and improve concentration. Once again, there has to be a balance, and the key again is fairness in setting and upholding policies about social media use. Now, one thing that companies have issues with is they don't want you to access the internet at work for personal use. Why? Because you actually expose their network, their system, their servers to possible hackers and infiltrators and viruses and things of the sort. Also, you're using company resources for personal time. So they're paying you to do personal stuff. That's a waste of money. So some studies put the cost of cyberloafing to about $85 billion per year just in the U.S. alone. There are different software tools that can be used to help reduce it, which also will limit access or length of time used, or both. And so companies are coming up with different ways, but understanding. And then some companies have it where any kind of smartphone that enters their network is going to be blocked from being able to get on the internet. So there's different ways in which they block. There are, of course, cyber threats, and hacking and human error by careless or improperly trained employees are part of the problem. Will likely to continue, right? Because we're all human, we make mistakes. There was a recent poll by the Organization of American States that surveyed 575 people in the North and South America region and found that 40% had experienced efforts to shut down their networks. There's various safeguards that should be put in place for protecting IT against disasters, system failures, and unauthorized access that can result in loss or damage. And when they calculated the cost per cybercrime victim has shot up to $298 per person, which is a 50% increase from over 2012, with the total cost of those amounting to $113 billion. So of those cyber crimes, $113 billion has gone towards people being victimized. And then, of course, you have some internal attacks by some really upset, employees. You have disgruntled employees and who are actually the biggest security threat that a business can face because they know too much and they're upset for whatever reason and they want to seek revenge. And that can happen. That happens all the time. So how can we protect against cyber threats? Table 15.6 shows you, for instance, don't use passwords that can be easily guessed. Make sure that you're using a mixture of upper and lower case, special characters. Don't use the same password for multiple sites. That's really easy. And once you figure out one password, then someone says, okay, most likely they're using the same one. Don't reveal sensitive information on your social networking. So making sure that you're using strict privacy settings, but also that you're making sure that you're following the other guidelines for passwords, making sure that you're careful about free and illegal downloads. File sharing programs are really where you find most of the spyware, and you can also find spyware that tied to movies, TVs, illegal songs that you've downloaded. Make sure you're mindful of liability issues, that employers routinely monitor employee emails for offensive messages, risky material. Understanding that whatever you engage in can lead the company to being exposed to lawsuits, that they're then being sued for your foolishness. And then lastly is keeping antivirus software updated, making sure that you're protecting your computer as much as possible. The software won't protect you forever, so you have to make sure that you're constantly staying up on the updates. An effective social media policy has some elements that you have to consider. And it describes the who, how, when, and for what purposes social media can be used and the consequences for non-compliance. And that policy can't only just clarify expectations and relieve guilt, but it needs to also prevent impulsive or abusive posts and messages that can damage the organization's reputation as well as the individuals. So you have to make sure that you create safe channels for employees to be able to air out their grievances before going online, clarify what's confidential, outline consequences if someone violates the policy, discuss appropriate ways to engage with people online, explain what's considered illegal, align the policy with your company's culture, and make sure that you're educating your employees and keeping them educated. So how we can handle emails better is making sure that, because we all have a love-hate relationship with them, right? We open up our inbox and we're just flooded with emails, and it can be a dread. We love that we can send an email 24/7 from anywhere around the world, but we hate that the average worker will receive hundreds of emails a day. And the more higher up or more, the larger your role within an organization, the more emails that you receive in a day. And the real fact is that none of us can handle more than a few dozen. So when we have hundreds waiting for us, that is potential disaster. And so we have to make sure that we turn off non-critical notifications, unsubscribe from newsletters, set aside about 2 15-minute periods a day to review email, making sure that we're not checking it compulsively. We're not reading and sending emails before or after work hours. And that we treat all emails confidential, right? We think twice about including people in a message because there may be someone who really doesn't need to read it. We're brief, professional, in that we make sure that we proofread our messages twice, not once, but twice. That's how we keep our errors down, avoid spelling and grammar and other issues. Make sure that you save emojis for personal messages. Remember that not every topic belongs on email, that certain things that are complicated or controversial, that needs to be limited to a phone or in person, right? So that you can avoid misunderstandings. And understanding that while texting, social networking, and other forms of electronic and digital communication have begun to reduce the dominance of email, it's predicted that the number of email users worldwide will continue to grow. They're expecting that we're going to reach 3 billion with a B people, or 1/3 of the world's population by 2019. So one reason is that so many other communication applications, as well as online shopping sites, require what? A valid email address to access. It's getting there. It's getting intense, folks. So how we can improve our communication effectiveness, we can look at our defensive communication, whether it's aggressive, attacking, angry, or passive-aggressive, or withdrawing communication. We can look at our non-defensive communication, which is assertive, direct, and being powerful. And you may be surprised to learn that defensive is often triggered by nothing more than a poor choice of words or nonverbal posture during interactions. And so in the language of behavior modification, these triggers are antecedents, right, of defensiveness. And an example of that is using absolutes like always, never. You always are late. You're never supportive of me. That's going to create a defensive response immediately. Someone's going to go on the attack because now they feel attacked. So trying to avoid using those absolutes because they're rarely true. It's rare that someone always doesn't agree with you or that someone never is supportive. It's rarely true. You can instead increase your communication competence by avoiding the defensive antecedents and employing positive ones or non-defensive communication, such as these right here. You can see the different style that's towards aggressiveness, towards defensiveness, and you can see the styles that are towards non-defensiveness. And so you have the antecedents of defensiveness and non-defensiveness, where some steps help to achieve non-defensive communication, which will help you to build relationships. First, frame your message in terms that acknowledge the receiver's point of view, which would free yourself of prejudice and bias, which would help you practice full disclosure. Pick a time and place conducive to communicating and listening. And then, of course, avoiding jargon. We spoke about that earlier. But if I say your work is sloppy, that's an evaluative style. That is going to put you on the defensiveness. If I say, listen to me, I've worked here 20 years. I'm now taking a superior stance, which is going to put you on the defensive side. If you share an idea and I say, we tried that idea in the past, it just doesn't work. Now you're going to be on the defensiveness. But if we look at me being descriptive, your work was 2 days late. Now you could try to be defensive, but for the most part, I'm not putting you in a defensive position. You can then acknowledge that, yes, it was 2 days late, and you could possibly explain why it's 2 days late. Problem-solving style of non-defensiveness would be, what do you think are the causes of the missed deadline? Right? So it allows for greater communication flow. It allows for clearing up misunderstanding, so on and so forth. So looking at this table, do you agree that the way we say things impacts the way a message is received? Can you see the subtle differences in the way these messages are communicated? It's a subtle shift. It's really key. Now, I mentioned earlier about empathy, and this works for managers because it's not the same thing as uncritically accepting others' words and behavior. Rather, it relies on a conscious effort to understand the emotional impact of our words and behavior. It helps you to walk in someone's shoes. And the CEO of Mahindra Group, it's an Indian multinational organization, the CEO, Anand Mahindra, said that true empathy is rooted in humility and the understanding that there are many people with as much to contribute in life as you. And so when we have empathy, we have an ability to recognize and understand another person's feelings and thoughts. It helps to foster open communication. It does require us to make two key actions. We have to be mindful and place our attention on that person's feelings and emotions being displayed both verbally and non-verbally, and we have to incorporate our understanding of another person's feelings and thoughts into our own communication. Now, how we can go about being an effective listener is through active listening. We're actively decoding, interpreting verbal messages, right? Making sure that receivers feel more understood, that conversations are more helpful and sensitive and supportive. Typically, only 20 to 50% of what we hear is active listening. So that lets you know that 50 to 80% of what we is gone, right? Now, typical listening styles: active is when I'm fully invested; involved, I'm partially invested; passive, it's not my responsibility to listen; and detached, I'm uninterested, right? This is our listening styles. This is how it translates. And so you can do the self-assessment on 15.5 to determine your typical listening style. Additionally, what style are you using right now, right? While you're listening to me, what listening style are you using? Think about it. I'm going to pause for a moment to let you think about that. Okay, so what might be the downfall of being a passive or detached listener during this lecture? What might be the downfall? Think about it. If you're detached or passive, if you're not interested or you don't think it's your responsibility to listen to this lecture, what's the downfall? What's the consequence? So table 1510 is going to show you some tips for effective listening. And I'm going to go through some of these. And show respect. Listen from the first sentence. So you have to turn off those internal thoughts and whatever you were thinking about the prior sentence to the interaction, what was happening prior to that interaction. You have to shut those down and listen to the very first sentence. Be mindful of what you say and how you say it. Keep quiet, right? 2 ears, 1 mouth. Use them accordingly. Try the 80-20 rule. So your conversational partner should speak 80% of the time and you should speak 20% of the time. So the other 80% of the time you should be listening. Ask good questions that are relevant. It helps to clarify and demonstrate that you're listening. Paraphrase and summarize. So basically you're going to repeat back to someone what you just heard. You're going to translate what you heard back to them and summarize it in a way that integrates or consolidates that entire conversation. Using both of these techniques help to make sure that communication was accurate and that you're both on the same page. Remember what is said. You're going to have to use that mental computer, and that may mean that you need to take notes or make an effort to try to log critical information. That is key to making sure the communication is effective and making sure that you're using nonverbal cues to demonstrate both your interest and involvement. So make sure you involve your body. Could following this advice help you be a better listener? And how will this skill help you at work and in your personal lives? Consider that. Now, how you can be an effective writer. This is very key, especially in this class, because I'm very, very, very on point when it comes to making sure that my students are better with their writing skills, because I know that it makes you stronger both in your academic but also in your professional lives. And so whenever you're writing, you need to start with your purpose. Why are you emailing or writing to someone? What you will find out with most senior leaders in an organization is that very first paragraph is what they're looking for. The very first paragraph in a letter, a memo, an email is to tell them why in the world they're reading this message. That's what they need to know. Based on that first paragraph will determine whether or not they're going to read paragraphs 2 to 10 or not. You need to make sure that your writing is simple, concise, and direct. Short and sweet is the key. Get to the point. Nothing too long. No 20 pages, right? If it's supposed to be 2, make it 2. Know your audience. Resist the urge to include everyone and think before you click reply all. Some things need to only go to specific people. Don't show your ignorance of the basics. You need to proofread, folks. Proofread. Follow those spelling and grammar rules. Make sure that it is free of errors, because when there's errors in your message, it's now a block. It's now noise. It's clutter in the message. You've now created a barrier. And make sure that you show respect. Use hello instead of hey or hi or just jumping in. I have some students who send me an email as though we're friends, like as though they're sending a text message to one of their buddies. No. Understand that what's fine amongst your friends is not fine for your manager. It's not fine for your instructor. It's not. So make sure that you also check spelling and names and titles, and proofread before you send it. Make sure you proofread. I understand that also some of us have autocorrect features on our devices that can make incorrect assumptions about what you meant to say, so that's why it's also important. And when I tell people to proofread, don't read silently. You need to read the message aloud so you can hear it, to see if it sounds the way you want the message conveyed. Now, the last thing, how to be an effective speaker. Just as I said, that very first paragraph of a letter, of a memo, of an email, you need to upfront tell people what you're going to say. So, for instance, good afternoon. You may not have thought much about identity theft, and neither did I until my identity was stolen twice. Today, I'll describe how our supposedly private credit, health, employment, and other records are vulnerable to theft and how you can protect yourself. I've now told you what I'm going to say. Then I say it. There are 5 ways the security of your supposedly private files can be compromised. The first way is blah, blah, blah. The second way is blah, 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 right? Now I've said it. And then tell them what you said. So, in conclusion, what can you do to protect against unauthorized invasion of your private files? I point out 5 main steps. Step 1, and I go through. Finally, let me close by sharing something that happened to me. I've covered it effectively. I'm telling you what I'm going to say. I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to tell them what you said. While 20% of working professionals in a recent survey said that they take almost any steps to avoid public speaking, 70% agreed that the ability to make a skillful presentation was critical to their careers. And even more said they would like to be better at it. In fact, reports of how widespread fear of public speaking is probably exaggerated. It's likely that about 40 to 45% of the population actually shares this fear. Some people find public speaking a stimulating challenge and an opportunity to burnish their professional skills and reputation. So there's a Toastmasters video on the 5 basic public speaking tips that I'm going to share with all of you. And I want you to watch it so that you can actually get some of the speaking tips so that you can improve to be an effective speaker. With that, that is the end of chapter 15. If you have any questions, please email me. Thank you.